of what's going on, in my opinion, with contemporary landscape painting and the idea of like technology and how that's influencing the work I make and the work other people are making. So I think now I just want to share my screen so you can see what I see. Okay, I'm gonna go full screen here. Okay, there we go. So I actually did my undergraduate studies in Vancouver at Emily Carr. In 2009, I graduated. And it sort of fiddled around with like really crazy experimentation while I was there. So I was making portrait paintings, I was making landscape paintings, I was kind of trying to make abstract paintings. I'm not sure I was making great paintings at the time, but the idea was I was experimenting a lot and studying with a bunch of really, really great professors. So I graduated there in 2009, and then from there I moved to Ottawa with my wife Genevieve, who's in this picture here on the platform, and did my Master's of Fine Arts at the University of Ottawa. So this picture here was from my graduation exhibition, which would have been in 2012. And while at the University of Ottawa, it became obvious I was like really honing in on the landscape genre as like a specific focus. And in a lot of ways, like I guess a focus on the Canadian landscape and Canadiana and what it means to be Canadian. I'm from a small logging town in northern British Columbia called Burns Lake. So a lot of my earlier works were kind of looping back to northern BC and like, what does it mean to be from northern BC and what are the politics of painting that landscape, and gradually sort of working towards like, what does it mean to paint a landscape? Like, what is a landscape to me and other people in Canada? Because it really is kind of like this de facto space that I think when a lot of people think about Canadian painting, they think about, you know, Emily Carr, the Group of Seven. And, you know, that's like a starting point for me for sure a long time ago. But I asked this question, like, what is the landscape as a genre? Like, is it a window? Is it a place that we can go to escape? Is it, you know, a portrait of the land? Like, how does this operate for us as like a picture on a wall? It can be all these things, I think. So I started really thinking about like the figure ground relationship, which in like painting terminology is basically, you know, like in the simplest of terms, you have like the figure in space. And I wanted to kind of explode that notion outwards from the painting. So for my graduation thesis exhibition, I had this platform built, which is, you know, sort of similar to something that you would stand on in like a national or provincial park that would have a viewpoint from which you could see a point of interest or like kind of a dazzle point in nature. And so it was relatively high up. I think it was like 7 feet off the ground. And when you were up there, it sort of forced your perspective to look down at this like really, really huge painting of Cathedral Park, which is situated just outside Keremeos in BC, sort of on the border between Washington and British Columbia. And just like a really, really beautiful spot, but it was somewhere where I'd kind of returned to over and over throughout my Emily Carr days. And that has kind of become like a theme in my work, is that I end up going back to the places that I've been frequenting physically through my painting practice. So it becomes sort of about like situating myself in space in a way too. So this here is probably one of the first paintings I exhibited in Toronto at Angel Gallery, which is where I've been showing since maybe 2014. So post-grad school, I really started to think about like these specific places. So this is again from Cathedral Park, a place called Lake of the Woods, not the one in Ontario. And I started to focus on these like clearings, like spots where you would be in the woods, where you would sort of arrive at a clearing at this like sort of contemplative space where you could like take a pause, and those sort of became like my go-to motif to start really like experimenting with the materials of painting and how to construct like a picture in a way that kind of went outside of what I had thought to at that point to be like conventional painting techniques. So I use a lot of stencils and masking in my work. So I kind of start to divide the picture plane up into these like faceted bits where the mark making with the brush or the palette knife or whatever I'm using usually starts and ends sort of outside of the spot that's stenciled off. And I'd say like a trend in my work gradually over the years has been to like kind of remove that traditional, those traditional techniques that like we would use to render like shadows or light or dark or what have you, like descriptive brushwork. I've sort of gradually moved away from that. And painting's really unique because the paintbrush, you know, is really, really ancient technology. People have been using paintbrushes for literally thousands of years, and not much has changed. You know, they've gotten better. We have synthetic brushes and, you know, brushes for thick paint, brushes for thin paint, but essentially the technology has remained the same, which to me is kind of cool because painting has changed so much in regards to the things we're painting, maybe how we're painting them, like conceptually speaking, but the technology itself is pretty basic, you know. And one of the, you know, last big innovations in painting technology was the advent of tube paint, which I think was like in the 1840s, and sort of predated photography and the daguerreotype and the camera only by a couple of years. And like that to me was like the next big technological innovation in relation to painting, was the arrival of photography, I think also in the 1840s, in which notably was like the first time everyone said, oh, painting's dead, you know, it's over, because now we have a better way of doing portraits of people and capturing the landscape. But of course, you know, painting's so much more idiosyncratic in a lot of ways, which is why I was really drawn to it. So this one here, this was a painting that was selected for the 2014 RBC Royal Bank Painting Competition, which isn't happening anymore. I think it's been a few years since the RBC competition ceased to be. But it was a really big thing in the Canadian painting world because once a year they'd select, I think it was 15 semi-finalists from across Canada, and they would exhibit your work. The year I was in it was at the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Montreal. But it really gave a spotlight to young painters who otherwise might not be able to get their work out into the gallery world. So after being in that competition, it like really changed my career and sort of increased my visibility, and sort of happened around the same time that I started showing with Angel Gallery. So yeah, it was like a really positive thing in my early development. And you know, just on like a more formal level, again, this is from Cathedral Park, and this was this spot that was kind of off one of the paths, and it was just this like really incredible little creek with this massive old growth tree that had kind of fallen across it. So I think this is a motif that I've painted easily probably 15 to 20 times. I haven't really kept track, but there's little sort of slippages in the way that I've worked. Like there's one spot sort of to the upper left quadrant where, you know, the big log that's fallen should be behind the gap of these two trees, but it isn't. And playing around with like figure ground stuff where certain things that look like they're further back in space are actually painted in the foreground. So I started kind of taking the way like people said you were supposed to paint. I mean, traditionally you paint from the background to the foreground, and I started just kind of deconstructing those things, using what I think is kind of like this collage approach to the picture plane. So I use masking as a way to not only divide up the picture plane, but also to have different applications and painterly techniques kind of butt up against each other, and sometimes like harmonious ways, and sometimes really kind of non-harmonious ways. So another one, I think this one's from, yeah, maybe around 2014. It was definitely in my first show at Angel in Toronto. And again, the clearing motif. And the idea with that show was that a lot of the works kind of mirrored each other. So that was one of them. But then adjacent to that in the same space was this one, which compositionally is just basically a mirror image. Yeah, it was this idea of like mirroring in the gallery, these like very, very similar but different spaces. And again, kind of opening up like a material space to play around. Like the trees that look yellow in this one were actually gold. So the paint was really, really reflective in this space. And it had this kind of, I guess like iridescent or kind of like glowing feeling. It reflected a lot of light. So it was kind of like a platform for experimentation, and both of those works eventually ended up at the Art Gallery of Mississauga, maybe a year later. I don't remember. I didn't write down any dates for this stuff, but I think this was 2014 or 2015, and it was a show they put on called Beyond the Pines, which contrasted the works of the historical painter Homer Watson, who is on the entire right side of that space, with contemporary Canadian artists, mostly in photography and painting and a bit of sculpture, who are working around the idea of like the Canadian landscape. So I know for sure that the work on the left is a Jennifer Carvalho, who's, I really, really love her work. And mine is kind of the third down. I think maybe it's an April Hickox in the middle. I can't be sure. So yeah, I'd sort of been developing this idea of making these really contemplative spaces for people to enter. And I got really interested in the idea that you could sort of traverse or like travel through these pictures with your eyes, and that they would become sort of a journey in their own right. So this is from 2017, and this was a painting that Air Canada commissioned for their signature lounge in the international wing of the Pearson International Airport in Toronto. It's sort of deceptively big. I think it was 7 feet tall by about 35 feet long, done in maybe 4 or 5 panels. I can't remember, but it's in pieces. But when it was installed, it was pretty seamless because everything lined up. And coincidentally painted in like a really, really tiny room. I remember when I was commissioned to do it, they kind of said, you know, like, how's your time this summer? They had a pretty tight timeline to get it finished. And they said, you know, have you got an appropriate space to make this gigantic painting? I said, yeah, I certainly do, but we had given notice at the house we were living at, and I had moved out of this old gymnasium that I was working in Ottawa, because we'd bought our first house out here in Wakefield. So I ended up making this thing in like a friend's living room, which was really, really tight. I had like one painting on each wall, and then moving it out and actually painting it in our bedroom out here, because when we moved here, you know, we live in this rural wooded place, and there's hardly any studios. So this thing, it's huge, but it was made in this like really, really cramped kind of environment. And it was funny, like when they installed it in Toronto, it was the first time that I'd seen it all together. But again, yeah, this idea of like traversing through an image and almost like a scroll, so like maybe a traditional like Chinese or Japanese scroll, where this one, obviously, because you come down this ramp on the left to enter the space, you would sort of travel through it like left to right. And yeah, again, kind of like this contemplative space, in this case for people who are traveling, coming to or fro through the airport. It was the first time I'd worked with kind of like a larger design team to collaborate on the colors, and obviously there was a lot of stuff going on between the materials that were chosen for the actual lounge and then what the final kind of aesthetics of the painting itself. Which brings me to this. So this was the same year. I think it was 2017. 2017 was like a really, really busy year for me. This show was at Angel Gallery in Toronto in their new space that they had moved into maybe a year or two previous. And unlike a lot of the other shows I had made that were exploring the idea of like my movements within Canada and the Canadian landscape, this show took the French painter Henri Rousseau's. He made these imaginary jungle paintings in the late 1800s. He'd never been to a jungle, but he painted. Most people are probably familiar with them, like the tigers in the jungle, and like his iconic red or orange sun that appeared in a lot of them. So I wanted to make these I took his sun as sort of like a reference point to make more of a narrative show. It was the first time I wanted to engage with the potential of landscape as a way of kind of telling a maybe more like environmental kind of narrative, something that could kind of obliquely speak to things like climate change or environmental degradation. So when you came in, there was this Salon Wall that you can see on the left with the repeated motif of Rousseau's sun in these different jungle settings. And sort of halfway through the show, there are these eclipse paintings, which were pretty dark. Like when you see them across the room, it would take a while for the image to kind of reveal itself to you. So there's this kind of narrative twist where there's an eclipse in the middle of the show, and then the final painting was this really big jungle fire, so like a bushfire, which in relation to a lot of my other stuff is a bit more of like an action painting, where there's like a total stillness to a lot of the work I'd done. A lot of the fire paintings I've made since then, an opportunity for this sort of like dynamic pictorial action. I think of them as like kind of like the climax of the show. And I've done a few now. I think there's like 3 or 4 of these paintings out there. I guess I could also speak a bit more to the process. Is like I work a lot between the contrasts of materials. So like the background of the eclipse paintings, you can see it's like more of a wash. And as you get closer to the foreground, a lot of the stuff is, it doesn't show up in photos that well, but it's actually quite sculptural and thick. So the paintings take on kind of an object quality, and that's something that I've been interested in for quite a while, is like paintings as images, but also as these sculptural things. So that was 2017. This was also 2017. So this is another gallery that I work with out of Edmonton, Peter Robertson Gallery. In this show, I had been to the Yukon on a Canada Council grant in 2016 to go up there and basically explore the landscape and the history of the Yukon, kind of going back to like Beringia and the idea of like the land bridge. And it really is like an ancient feeling landscape. Yeah, so whereas a lot of the other works I'd made to that point had this like really sort of shallow sense of depth, these paintings I started making for this show kind of ended up having, I guess you can see it on the one on the left in particular, this really dramatic vanishing points where there was all of a sudden like really, really deep space. And that was something I hadn't really done. I mean, it's kind of a Renaissance trope as a, like the idea of perspective, like the illusion that something is far, far away on this totally flat surface. Yeah, so those paintings kind of became about that, but also kind of referencing the gold rush and kind of the problematics of that. So there's some drawings on the Salon Wall of like this repeated motif of this gold miner and these like looming ravens that were kind of these cutout collage works on paper, and the skulls, and so sort of like vaguely suggesting this, kind of darker narrative of, the colonization of the West, but also, you know, the intrusion of capitalism into this really serene and kind of ancient landscape. So yeah, it's the Salon Wall is definitely something I've worked with off and on throughout my career so far, in terms of like a way of storytelling, mostly, and narrative, and kind of giving these really like generous spaces for viewers to enter into, to kind of get immersed in like the backstory or the narrative of what's going on. So this is the big one that was on the left, and again, like really, really deep space. And compared to a lot of the other pictures I made, like a lot of the bits and bobs in these ones are really kind of micro, like little tiny things. So like all the tiny little trees in the midground are, you know, smaller than like an eraser head on a pencil. So it was the first time working really big where there was like all these really, really tiny elements kind of coming together for the gestalt, or like the overall of the picture. This one's of the Dempster Highway. For any of you who haven't been up in the Yukon or up on the Dempster is, I think it's an 800-kilometer dirt highway that basically goes from Dawson City all the way to the Arctic Ocean up in the Northwest Territories. And it's kind of like this incredibly vast and not empty by any means, but like devoid of a lot of humans. I think the first gas station is after something like 400 kilometers of this crazy dirt road, which is either, you know, weather dependent, either in like really amazing condition or really terrible condition. So again, playing with like the central vanishing point, which is something that I hadn't really done, going into this like deep space kind of in the middle of the picture. And again, working between like thick and thin applications and the clouds, having this kind of like collage aspect to them, with like a lot of varying kinds of brush marks. So, you know, there's sort of like right in the smack dab in the middle, there's kind of these swirly brush marks within that central cloud, but then some of the ones to the side are applied with like a palette knife, and they're really thick. So again, the photos don't really do them justice because the layers on the surface are actually quite textured. So this must have been 2018. Another show at Angel Gallery called Letting Go is Hard. It was kind of about being from BC and having this like homesickness to go back there for a really long time, and finally moving to Wakefield, which geographically is not similar to BC, but is nonetheless very, very beautiful and filled with hills and forests and rivers and lakes. And it's kind of like I always tell people from home that it's like kind of a miniature BC where everything is like, you know, the trees and the hills and everything are smaller, but nonetheless it's really, really amazing. So this was the first show where I made works of like our new home, kind of like from this spot where I was like accepting that, okay, you know, I'm happy to be here, and even though letting go is hard, like I'm kind of doing that. So these in some ways like kind of a bit more sentimental than some of my other works. There were a lot of sunset paintings, and some of my first flower paintings were in this show. Yeah, and playing around with like contrasts and pairings. And so the work on the right obviously has more, it's a painting of my flower garden. We have a medicinal flower garden that kind of grows around the perimeter of our property, and contrasting that with these really like keyed up spray painted backgrounds on the sunset there. I'm just looking at the time and realizing I probably need to speed up a little bit. Or not, maybe we won't make it through all the pictures. This one gives you a sense, like the red outlines in the foreground are actually like the super thick paint, so the sculptural quality. This was the last show I did at Angel, I guess it was last year. Time goes by quickly. Yeah, and this one was all about like oceans and this kind of fictional storm. So the whole show was kind of built around a tempest. The title of the show was Breaker. And it kind of marked a break. Like there were not many trees, not much earth, no mountains, mostly these like really dramatic kind of moody wave paintings contrasted with these monochromes. So there's a monochrome on the left there. And it's sort of the beginning where I started to think more of like the technology that we're looking at paintings and looking at pictures through. So these images were kind of cobbled together, like they're mostly from my imagination, but they're cobbled together also out of like old ocean paintings and like stock photography from the internet that kind of like degraded down into pixels and things. So these become more sort of pixelated, and the movement becomes sort of like these little, you know, expressed through these little lines and really simplified in a lot of ways. So that one, you know, gives you an idea of the size with the install shots. This one here, I think is about, that's 5 by 4 feet tall. And there's the monochrome Blue Moon that was beside it. So these monochromes I started to work out, I thought like, what's kind of the base level for painting? And of course, in modernism, we had Rodchenko, the Russian painter, I think in like 1919, made a trio of monochrome paintings. I think they were like red, yellow, and green. He said, that's it, painting's over. I've reduced it to like its base level. Like there's nothing more base than this. It's just color on a surface. And I thought, wow, that's kind of a fun starting point as a landscape painter, to go from like, how do you make a picture out of just one color that can be dynamic in a big space and kind of resonate, and still give viewers this like generous viewing experience. So this one, I guess the picture shows the sculptural quality of the work a lot more. And this too, so the smaller one, taking, I think it was Varley's painting, The Storm, the famous storm painting on Georgian Bay. So again, really sculptural, really pared down. This is from the show I just did this spring, in just kind of right on the cusp of the COVID shutdown, in Edmonton. That was called Omega, and that show is sort of, I guess, the most, in my opinion, about climate change and sort of where we're at ecologically. My family and I had been on a road trip to California last summer, and I was like really excited about the Californian landscape. I wasn't expecting it to be so amazing, and like these dramatic old growth forests, the redwoods, like trees kind of like the size of the room that I'm sitting in right now. But also this history of kind of activism and environmentalism. So I wanted to start the show with a text painting of Rachel Carson's seminal environmental book, Silent Spring, which was about the use of pesticides and the death of songbirds. And kind of one of the first examples of someone saying, you know, what we're doing to the planet is having these like super adverse effects. So this one's the same size as the blue painting from the last show. It's about 5 by 4 feet. And paintings of the redwoods. But the departure point for this show again was kind of like these like fictional fires that might happen. Like what would happen if the Founders Grove in the redwoods caught on fire? So that's quite a large painting, but also using text and sort of referencing books and films to create this like overall narrative for a show, like a loose narrative, but a narrative nonetheless. This is from a Quentin Tarantino movie. I think that's like 3 by 6 feet or something, kind of self-explanatory. This is a work in progress just from my studio. So this is kind of where I'm heading. And I began to experiment more with making digital sketches and then taking that back into painting land in the studio with like physical work. So these are all kind of half done. But this play between like the digital and the analog sort of binary in painting is really exciting to me right now. So yeah, making digital, like sort of deconstructing these floral motifs and then reassembling them in a program that's like Photoshop, and then making them into paintings and then kind of playing around with them. And the departure point for those ones in a lot of ways for me is Matisse's paper cutouts, the floral pictures he made once he was ill later in life, where he would cut out all these paper flowers, and he had some assistants who would put them on the wall and move them around and sort of compose pictures out of them. But I'm using like the magic wand tool in Photoshop and sort of selecting and cutting out and assembling in Photoshop, and then reassembling them in actual paint on actual surfaces. Some of the first paintings where I'm using airbrush to get that kind of like really smooth kind of surface inside like all of those serrated, pixelated edges. So these will be in my show in at Angel Gallery that's opening up on September 24th. And these are all, I guess it's worth noting that these are all at risk or almost extinct flowers that live in Canada. So I like the idea of kind of taking these things that are really at risk and then kind of deconstructing and reconstructing them. And I also just wanted to show people, yeah, I think I have time. It's been 30 minutes. I wanted to show people just like what's going on out in the landscape painting world, because you know, as a painter, you're constantly engaging with other people's works and kind of like, oh, I like this and I like that. And you're never really separate from the history of painting, I feel like everyone's kind of immersed in that. And there's like a really, really rich and varied amount of work going on in the field that I'm interested in. So I'm going to kind of blow through these, but just to give you, I mean, if you're a painter and you're listening right now, then you've probably seen a lot of these, but if you're not, maybe it could pique your interest. So this is Lois Dodge. She lives in New York. I think she's like 93 years old, and she's been doing it for a really, really long time. And she's, to me, just kind of like a painter's painter. She makes these amazing paintings. And she makes it look extremely easy, which painting isn't. Like, I guess it's kind of worth knowing, like, painting is an extremely frustrating medium, and you know, you're kind of always failing from time to time. Like every week in the studio, there's usually a day where I'm like, oh man, that was a bit of a failure. So it's kind of this humbling thing, and I think that's a big part of the reason why it's held my interest. But anyways, she makes it look extremely easy. David Hockney, who, I mean, most people, even if you're not into art, you've probably seen this picture. It's called like A Larger Splash, British painter. Also probably in his 90s now, or late 80s. He's old, and he's still doing it. And he's doing amazing things. Like in the 60s, 70s, 80s, he was kind of exploring the relationship between like the flat image of the photo and painting. But then in like 2010, he started making these iPad paintings, and again was kind of like ahead of the times. So these are of Yosemite, which I probably included because I was there last summer. It's an amazing place, but also like very touristy. Mama Andersson, who's Swedish, makes these kind of like really moody landscapes that sort of touch on ideas like memory and place, and like there's sometimes figures in them, but I love this one because there's sort of like the history of the mark making with the paintbrush is kind of tied up in like this tangled maze of the track marks from the tires that are going down this road. I think it's called Dead End. Yeah, she's one of my favorites for sure. Mama Andersson. This is Hervin Andersson, who's a British painter who was the son of Jamaican immigrants. A lot of his landscapes reference places in the 60s and during the civil rights movements where Black people were not allowed to go. So like this one was of a, he had a country club series, and it was kind of like a place that was off limits. So he's kind of reclaiming these spaces through the painted surfaces. And again, like just an amazing dynamic painter playing with like thick and thin, and beautiful contrast of like brush marks. And to me, he's like one of the master mark makers out there. So that's Hervin Andersson. This is Melissa Brown, and this kind of references more like computer generated stuff. She's American. I think she lives in New York. So like that whole bottom register of the grass, like to me, like maybe it's screen printed. I'm not sure, but she uses Probably like airbrushes and screen printings, like the visor in this car here with all the dots kind of references like Liechtenstein and like the pop art from the 60s, 70s. But you got the iPhone there with the light coming off. I think they're so playful and fun. There's another one of hers, again, probably like airbrush and stuff. Great contrast of colors, Melissa Brown. This is Hilary Pecki, who lives in LA. And for me, like I've noticed a trend in landscape painting that a lot of people are kind of referencing back to like David Hockney and Alex Katz and Henri Matisse. And I love it. It's such a sweet zone for painting, but that's what her work kind of reminds me of. But really beautiful palettes and kind of like taking the ordinary stuff from your day-to-day experience and elevating it. Hilary Pecki. This is Cynthia Daniel. I think she lives in Baltimore. I didn't look it up, but she's got kind of like an atlas project where she makes these really, really tiny paintings and then turns them into these enormous installations. So I think this was kind of like a painting a day for a year or something from all her travels. And just like a really dynamic, really talented painter and like highly representational, but also as like a document of like the American experience. And a lot of her more current work is more political, but this is like really rooted in landscape. And this is Guy Yanai. I think he is Israeli. I really like his work because he mostly works just with these like horizontal or vertical brush strokes, which, you know, you think like, oh, anyone can like make a straight line up or down. But it has this like oddly digital aesthetic. It feels almost like it was generated straight out of a computer. I'm a big fan. Again, like making it look really easy, even though it isn't. And this is a reference to David Hockney, one of Hockney's sprinkler paintings. And then this one here is obviously referencing the David Hockney painting we just looked at with the larger splash. And I think this might be the last one. One of my favorite painters right now, Jonas Wood, who lives in LA, and he paints kind of like right across the board, but also makes landscapes. And again, these like really kind of simplified looking compositions and picture planes, but so well designed, and he's a real master of color. So this is probably one of his only like kind of political works in my view, because it's the view from where the shootings happened in Las Vegas a number of years ago. And yeah, I included this one just to give you a sense of scale. So like most of these people, maybe with the exception of Cynthia Daniel and Lois Dodge, make like pretty enormous paintings, which is kind of a thing in their world. And that is it. And wow, 40 minutes on the nose. It's like I planned it.
Okay, thank you very much, Gavin. As I've mentioned in the beginning, you're free to either raise your hand if you have a question or write the question down for me to voice the question to Gavin. We do have already here a few questions. So the first question that I have here, Gavin, is what is your favorite season to paint?
I like the fall the best for sure, and there's some reasons for it. I mean, I like fall because it's like temporally it doesn't last very long. There's a lot of action, especially where we live. We get the full sort of Canadiana colors here. But secretly I hate summer. Well, not secretly, I'm going to tell you, I hate summer in this part of the world. It's so hot and so humid, and I think a lot of people get seasonal affective disorder in the winter when there's like not enough sunshine and, you know, it's cold out. I think I'm the other way around. Summer for me is really hard, and then fall feels like when it cools down, the humidity drops, like this huge sense of relief. And also like, you know, everyone's getting back to school and everyone's getting kind of back into work mode. Like I find it harder to work in the summer just because it's like, you know, you want to be in a river or a lake or hanging out with your friends. So fall and winter for me, for sure.
Okay, thank you. So next question that I have here is there a specific landscape you dream about painting that you haven't gone to before to get inspiration from?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, we went to the desert in Utah last year as a part of our road trip. So like Arches National Park and like your really classic, like, you know, like the spires of rock in the desert and no water and just everything's red. I've been dreaming, I took a lot of pictures. I've been dreaming of painting that and I just haven't gotten around to it. Every time I'm like, I'm gonna paint the desert, I'm already kind of into another body of work. Or, you know, painting kind of operates like you go on these like micro tangents for 3 or 4 or 5 months where, you know, maybe you start using really bright colors, or maybe like right now I'm doing these kind of like digital floral things that become really all consuming. So, but yeah, the desert for sure I want to paint at some point.
So thank you. I have here another question actually from Claire. Claire is a young artist, so she is seeking your advice in
Cool.
terms of working with deadlines. She's saying, I just got my first few commission works, and I'm experiencing a little bit of stress during these times to work with a time schedule. Do you have any advice for that?
Well, first of all, I can empathize. I've got 2 big deadlines right now, and I'm feeling a little stressed myself. Advice for working with deadlines: don't procrastinate. I would say painting for me is like a long haul thing. I've been doing it quite a while. Is really, I mean, I don't work 9 to 5 hours. I work more like 9 till midnight when I'm really busy. And I've had a lot of late nights lately. When painting's good, I tend to keep going. So like if you're feeling it, keep at it and just go for it. But also if you're not feeling it, sometimes just showing up and doing it regularly is the best thing. And also to like not put too much pressure on yourself, because you know, if people are asking you for commissions, then it means there's something amazing going on with your work already, and that yeah, just not to try not to stress. I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So we have here another question, which is how much imagination you use in your paintings, or is all reality?
um I would say there's a big blend. Like the Rousseau inspired show, those paintings were completely made up. Like there was no real, like I used his son as a point of reference. um and then like now I'm working with these like digital collages I've been making, and they're quite concrete because I'm working from an image that I've constructed in the computer. But I would also argue that it took a lot of imagination to sort of end up at the working methodology to make that kind of image. So it's a blend. I mean, you have to, I think I have like kind of an overactive imagination in a visual way. And that I try to keep tapped into that as much as possible, for sure. But there's, you know, uh, the shows that are about more specific places, like the Yukon, definitely had less. I think there was one like completely imaginary picture in that show. But it's a blend. I'd say 50-50.
Thank you. So next question. So Michael's asking if you consider your paintings a form of activism.
Um, yeah, I guess so in a way. I do, because, you know, when you make work that's kind of about climate change or the changing oceans, even if they're operating in a metaphoric way, if you reach, you know, just 1 or 2 people and they say, oh, you know, that's like something we should consider more directly, then it's a success. So I think it was Rancière, the French philosopher, said, you know, no gesture is like, well, all gestures are political, whether you intend for them to be or not. So I guess in a way, those are. Like it would be hard for me, like if I walked into a gallery and saw a picture of like a burning forest, not to think of the wildfires or climate change or what have you. So um, yeah, I think in sort of um, a roundabout way that they could be seen that way. Like I hope that some people take that away from them.
So next question. Your paintings always seem to take us through a story. Did you ever consider writing some stories to go along with your paintings, or you leave it up to the person who's watching them?
That's a good question. At the beginning of COVID, like during the shutdown, when everything felt so precarious and scary, I actually did write some short stories. They were mostly about space, like deep space and time, and the idea of like time and space versus like time, like eternity and nothingness. Um, yeah, but I mean, I probably never read those to anyone except for like my wife. Yeah, I that's what I like about art is the subjective quality. So, you know, three people come into the gallery and look at your picture, and all three of them could walk away with something different. So I really like that about art, is that it speaks to different people in different ways.
Thank you. So here's another question, also from Claire. Which would you say it's the easiest color to work with? Because I'm seeing lots of greens and blues into your paintings. Does it mean that it's easier to work with, or they're your favorite colors?
I just love green. I love green so much. I mean, I don't know. I grew up in the woods and I live in the woods now. So yeah, I've been surrounded by green for like 2/3 of my life. Easy colors to work with. I would say red is kind of a hard color to work with. Like it invokes so many different kinds of feelings. In terms of ease, I don't know. You kind of find your own palettes. I was talking to a friend actually recently. I've got this project going on the side before my show, and it required like a careful consideration of color for a kind of a specific place. And I have a friend in British Columbia who is a color expert. She used to like choose colors for a few different like outdoor and fashion companies. So she thinks about color in more of like a psychological way than I do, for sure, and maybe more analytical. Like I go on feeling, and I think like I can get places with color relatively quickly now. I'm getting more confident. But she was like, "Yeah, your 99.9% of your work is green. Have you ever really thought about that?" And I was like, not specifically, but it definitely made me think about it.
Yeah. Next question also over here is there anything that appeals to you from an urban landscape, or you're entirely focused on a more nature side?
Yeah, I'm interested in urban landscapes. It's interesting that like I lived in the city from, I don't know, the time I was 20 until the time I was 40, so 20 years. And I painted almost exclusively, you know, when they were landscapes, there was always of nature. But now that I'm out in nature, I've definitely considered making some urban landscapes. It's always timing though, you know, and as a painter working full time with deadlines and expectations to produce shows in a certain amount of time, it's one of those kind of side projects I just haven't quite found the time for yet. But there's an image I ended up when we were in San Francisco last year taking a lot of shots from our hotel, and then I ended up flying back to Vancouver to see a friend for his birthday and took a bunch of pictures off another friend's balcony in Vancouver. And those pictures have kind of been, I guess this is what happens as a painter, is like a lot of the time either you have an idea or you have a picture that kind of sits with you and stews and marinates for a long time. And the longer it's in there, the higher the chances that you'll end up making a painting of it someday. So I think, yes, I will make paintings of urban spaces. It might just take a while.
Thank you. We did have quite a few questions lined up. So now I have one last question, but I would still open up the floor to a few questions. So if you have any last minute questions, just please feel free to write them. So the next question is, Is your work process mostly very individualistic? So you're usually working alone, or do you usually collaborate with other people as well in your paintings?
Well, I wouldn't say that I collaborate. I mean, since COVID, I've been in my studio alone for sure. Um, but generally speaking, I've had helpers, studio assistants off and on, probably for like the last 7 years. But those people, I mean, primarily they're doing all the like really non-glamorous, not fun stuff. So washing brushes, and there's a lot of blow drying because my work is very layered. And also like cutting stencils out. So I'll draw a stencil, and sometimes if the person has a steady hand, they'll like cut the stencil out for me. But yeah, it's not really a collaboration in my studio, just because they are my pictures and they're kind of like these unique visions. But I am starting a side project right now with a designer friend from Squamish, and we're working on making a line of bags, like tote bags and fanny packs, and maybe like a gym duffel bag. That sort of incorporates elements of my art with elements of his design work, because he used to be a designer for Arc'teryx and has made stuff for RYU, and he's like quite an accomplished designer, and one of my best friends, and we have a lot of sort of aesthetic crossovers, and we're both like nature lovers, and we've been really close. He was in industrial design at Emily Carr when I was in fine arts, and yeah, I've just been wanting to collaborate with him forever, and could never really think of a sensible way to do it. We're always like, oh, we should do something together. So it seems like kind of a cool space, and again, kind of like a COVID project where I was like, these sort of like scary, uncertain times have kind of like propelled me into trying to do more of the things I've been wanting to do, just because, you never know.
So thank you. I don't think we have any further questions. That being said, because I've sent each and every one of you my email with the invitation for the Zoom call, if you do have any questions after the talk ends, just feel free to send them, and I can forward them to Gavin as well. I just want to thank again Gavin so very much for accepting this invitation. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and I wish you a very happy weekend and week. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.